community in Canada is rich, and they can fill that gap. Canada needs to build volunteer-based civilian capacities so that we do not consistently rely on our last resort option. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Fijis, 5 minutes, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Thank you so very much. And good afternoon to all the members of the esteemed Committee on National Defense. As mentioned, my name is Mike Fesh. I'm currently a doctoral candidate at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs and an assistant professor at the Royal Military College. It's an honor to appear in front of you today as an individual to address the domestic demands on the Canadian Armed Forces and to discuss some of my recent research on the Canadian Armed Forces primary reserves and aid to the civil power. I want to start by saying that this is a very interesting time in Canadian defense history. And in regards to domestic demands that are being placed on the CAF, there are a number of converging concerns that are taking place today. First, as my esteemed colleague mentioned, the effects of climate change are increasing in Canada. They're becoming more frequent and severe, they're affecting more Canadians, and they're costing Canadians billions of dollars in damages. Second, the number, frequency, and intensity of CAF domestic response operations are also increasing across Canada. Today, almost 50% of the CAF current operational deployments are now domestic. And recently, there have even been short periods of time where there were more CAF members deployed on domestic operations than international operations. So what was once considered an unexpected frequency of domestic deployments has now become almost an annual event or an annual cycle. And this challenges the CAF in new ways. And third, despite many noble attempts to increase our size, the Canadian Forces is getting smaller. And because of this, there is a steady but increasing reliance on the primary reserve force. Of note, the 2015-2016 Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces Report on Plans and Priorities sees the Army Reserve, while leveraging existing unit structures and capacities, eventually taking the lead in domestic operations with support from the regular force. This is a reversal of the current role. Unfortunately, these trends are likely to continue converging, and even the previous Chief of the Defense Staff has admitted publicly that present-day demands have the potential to engage the military beyond its capacities. So today, a smaller CAF needs to be prepared to respond to multiple and increasingly demanding emergencies concurrently with its part-time soldiers. So the key question that I would ask the committee is, how do we ensure that our Canadian Forces Reserve personnel are supported and are able to respond decisively when called upon? As such, Canadians need to examine our overall preparedness strategy and, from a Canadian Forces perspective, the organizational approach that underpins our response strategies. So I would ask that the committee consider two themes to improve the way that the CAF primary reserves can better support the provinces and the territories. First, the current conditions of service for the primary reserve allows for much greater latitudes than the regular force, who serve under a different kind of social contract. Perhaps it's time to reevaluate this. And second, after transformation, any domestic headquarters, with the exception of Joint Task Force North, where all activities are deemed to be operations, many of these new headquarters that were created after transformation were actually superimposed on top of or developed from other existing headquarters. So domestically, when the Army Reserve trains, they do so at the unit level in local armories across the country. But when called upon, they undergo a transformation and deploy through territorial battalion groups, domestic response companies, and even Arctic response company groups. However, on a daily basis, these headquarters have only one small staff or a small staff dedicated to domestic operations, and they have no permanent operational units placed underneath them. So if the future climate of the Canadian Forces resembles the 2011 Leslie report, and we seek to reduce overhead and improve efficiency and effectiveness, but we do so despite constrained resources, then the CAF will have to look at how its reserve force is managed institutionally and how it can rapidly and effectively respond when called upon. I understand that significant efforts to optimize reserve participation in future domestic operations are ongoing, especially through new and emerging capabilities such as cyber. But it is the modernization of headquarters and personal policies to create more enduring conditions of employment that are required to better leverage the reserve force contributions. So to conclude, strong, secure, and engaged confirms that the defense of Canada and its people remain the overarching priority for the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Forces. But my final point here, based on my research, is that in the event of a large-scale crisis, without dedicated personnel and established command structures, specifically within the primary reserve force, any whole of government emergency response will be that much more difficult to execute. Thank you very much for your time.
And finally, Mr. McDonald, 5 minutes, please.
Great. Good day, Mr. Chair and other members of the committee. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak at today's session to share my thoughts regarding the Canadian military's role in domestic emergency response. The last decade has seen a sizable increase in provincial requests for assistance from the Canadian Armed Forces in dealing with domestic emergencies, specifically, but not only, due to the growing number and severity of climate change-induced natural disasters throughout the country. The Canadian Armed Forces has and continues to adapt to this new reality by augmenting its capacity to support these growing requests, such as by establishing a yearly mission, Operation Lentus, to train and place on standby soldiers to assist, as well as a growing coordination between regional joint task force commands and provincial emergency management organizations. Such efforts serve a long-standing and clear mandate for the military to be prepared to offer such assistance as reiterated in the current defense policy. However, these increasing requests are transforming this mandate from a as-needed to a baseline regularized duty, which combined with competing capability, operational, and structural issues confronting the organization have generated debates about what the role of the Canadian Armed Forces should be in domestic emergency response. Two main questions lie at the heart of this matter. First, are these requests for support sustainable for the military to manage without compromising its other missions and priorities? Second, is the military the suitable organization for addressing these challenges, in effect becoming the de facto emergency response organization for provinces as part of larger efforts to construct more resilient systems and societies in the face of climate change throughout Canada? With the recently announced National Defense Review and ongoing development of the National Adaptation Strategy, now is the time to explore this matter as a political issue and not simply a technical, resource, and/or organizational one. It is understandable why the military is increasingly relied upon during these emergencies, as it possesses unique organizational, logistics, planning, and personnel resources and qualities which no other government body at any level does. Operations Laser, the prepositioning and deploying of units to support provincial government requests, and Vector, assisting the Public Health Agency of Canada to secure and distribute vaccines during the pandemic, have showcased the military's unique attributes in these regards. But higher level political direction and guidance is needed to entrench this mission as a top tier mandate if the status quo is to continue, as it is becoming clear that if the Canadian Armed Forces is to continue to meet these requests for support, they will have to create more capacity and possibly dedicated capabilities to do so. There are strong reasons to reconsider the growing reliance on the military and domestic emergency response. First, there are competing demands on the military's focus, operational capacities, and resources in terms of adapting to the altering strategic landscape defined by the emergence of rival great powers, numerous large-scale procurement renewal plans, building new capabilities in emerging domains such as cyber and space, and reconstitution challenges regarding training, recruitment, retention, and culture change. Second, there are possible civil military implications of any growing ownership of domestic emergency response by the military if this is increasingly becoming a mainline duty. Third, these developments may disincentivize provincial governments from investing in their own specific emergency services capabilities and lead to growing societal expectations for military assistance in every domestic emergency, thus transforming perceptions of the military as a frontline service rather than a force of last resort to be used after civilian agencies have been exhausted or overwhelmed. If the military, however, is mandated to continue and possibly fully prioritize these requests and prepare to support the expected growth and demand of these into the future, serious examination of how best to structure and resource the organization so that it can do so sustainably is required. Such an examination should explore 4 key areas. First, whether a new operational command is required to plan, train, coordinate, and oversee the domestic deployment of military assets in these missions. Second, whether existing support capabilities should be expanded beyond not just servicing the needs of the military, but towards meeting broader emergency response demands such as healthcare, logistics, and engineering capabilities. Third, whether dedicated units should be constructed which are exclusively trained and deployed for these type of missions, allowing other elements of the military to focus on different missions and mandates. And finally, whether these units and capabilities should be part of the regular or reserve force, with particular deliberation on the duties of and extent to which the latter as a volunteer service should be relied upon in this sense. The question is not whether the Canadian Armed Forces should or should not be involved in domestic emergency response. It has and will always have a role, especially because it possesses unique capabilities such as search and rescue and strategic lift, which would be difficult to replicate elsewhere. What is needed, however, is determining the scale and scope of military involvement, its purpose and function, as part of a broader whole of government and indeed whole of society effort to adapt to the disruptive realities of climate change on our economy, infrastructure, and society, which will only increase in intensity moving forward. Such a determination requires public deliberation and clear political direction rather than letting mission creep to continue being uncritically examined. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Ms. Finley, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here. Professor Fedges, is that how I say your name, sir? How do I pronounce your last name?
It's pronounced Fayesh.
Fayesh. Well, that sounds a lot more smoother than what I was trying to do to butcher it. I just want to express all our condolences on the loss of your cadets at RMC, because I see that you're a lecturer there. It's very tough reality. And so Parliament did hold a moment of silence, a minute of silence today for them, and formally acknowledge their loss. So please pass that along to the community. We feel that loss with them. So maybe I'll just start with you, Professor, seeing as I singled you out at the beginning. I understand what you're telling us in your testimony, but I'm wondering what solutions you might be suggesting. You've posed some good questions on current conditions of service and whether we need some sort of permanent operational force. What would you be recommending if you were the one saying, how do we deal with this? Should we be looking at a separate force like the U.S. have through FEMA, or should we be looking at a specialized group within the military? What's your thought on that?
Thank you very much. I do not advocate for a separate military force or dedicated resources specifically for domestic response. However, I do advocate for what people would actually call the recapitalization or the operationalization of the reserve force. Right now, as I mentioned in my testimony, the reserve force is business is conducted on a voluntary basis. So when there is a call out, it's basically a determination of who is available and who would like employment. So if you look at what happened during, I believe, the summer of 2020 during COVID, basically the military came forward and said, anybody who wants 4 to 5 months of employment over the summer, please step forward and you will be gainfully employed. And this was conducted. However, in my professional opinion, I don't feel that this gives the military the latitude to support Canadians to their full extent. I would call for some sort of reanalysis on the terms of service for reservists. For example, right now, a reservist, and there are 3 distinct differences between a regular force soldier and a reserve soldier. They cannot be posted, they cannot be deployed, and they can choose to leave the military at any time. And I would call not for perhaps the same terms of service as a regular force soldier, but I would ask us to look into the terms of service for reservists. Perhaps there's some sort of accommodation that could be made there that would allow the government and the Canadian Forces to call on reserves in a little bit more organized structure. Thank you.
That's good. Mr. Bowen, you were talking about leveraging municipal and provincial groups and NGOs with disaster capacity. So how do you see that working? Can you expand on that a bit?
Thank you for the question. One of the things that we've seen in some of our most significant allies, specifically Australia and the United States, is moving away from having the military hold primary responsibility for responding to disasters. And that's a recognition both of the competing demands that are on those forces, but also of the cost. From 2017 to 2019, the CAF incurred $17.5 million in incremental costs for deploying on Operation Lentis. And with the average duration of those deployments being about 2 weeks, that translates into roughly $80,000 a day in additional capabilities or additional costs. When we look at building out and supporting NGOs and provincial municipal organizations to have hyper-localized, trained, equipped volunteer teams across the country, we see a dramatic reduction in time and costs. As an example, I know that Team Rubicon's incident management team and their debris management team costs were $3,000 per day. That's an order of magnitude reduction in costs overall. And so if we're able to empower NGOs, provide a little bit of funding, and then empower provincial and municipal organizations to be able to take on that role so that when we do require the CAF to come in, they are truly that force of last resort. One of the key things that needs to be done, and I think this dovetails quite nicely with Mr. Fayish's comments, we need to build systems in place so that small businesses aren't penalized when their employees want to volunteer. We need to build systems in place so that employees aren't penalized when they want to volunteer to help Canadians. So much like's been done in some of the provinces, employees or employers can get tax breaks or access to funding to be able to allow their reservists to go and deploy overseas or deploy on disaster response operations. If we could put something in place that's the same mechanism when Canadians want to volunteer their time to go support fellow Canadians, that's going to dramatically reduce the cost associated with deploying people to support disasters and increase that local knowledge and that local participation to reinforce and rebuild and support communities at the local level.
Thank you.
Colleagues, you'll take note that the bells are ringing. And I suspect the vote is in half an hour, is that correct?
I've got 28:45.
So half an hour. Can I have unanimous consent to go ahead for the next 15 minutes? Well, we've got our witnesses here. So that'll take us to 20 to 5. I apologize to the witnesses. The issue here is the committees are supposed to suspend when bells start ringing, but our colleagues have graciously decided that we can continue for 15 minutes. At that point, we will have to suspend, and then we'll have to figure out how long it's going to take to vote. And anyways, welcome to democracy. Ain't she grand? Madame O'Connell, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. Perhaps I'll continue with Mr. Bowen or Professor Bowen. So if I'm understanding correctly, you would like to focus more on a voluntary system, but would you see maybe even ownership or housing of the leadership and organization of that system in some role within CAF or a unit within CAF? Or do you see it more as potentially each province and territory establishing their own system with maybe some federal guidance? Just help me understand kind of how you would envision or what you would recommend in terms of, the initial setup of that and how then we ensure consistency of training and the ability even to cross provinces and territories if one province needs a little bit of help, how they could have that system move over as well.
Thank you very much for the question. And I think you're absolutely on point. Competent disaster response teams cannot be created after the disaster occurs. So we need to build a national structure in which we're standardizing training, in which we're standardizing capabilities, and we're standardizing the modality through which organizations and volunteers deploy. So if we look at the current structure, Public Safety Canada provides guidance to the provinces, and in coordination, then they develop their own individual capabilities. If we were to nest a deployment coordination group within the GOC or within Public Safety Canada specifically, that then alleviates the strain on the CAF to be able to hold a resource and manage a resource that they don't own or control, and quite often have friction with based on historical precedents. So leveraging organizations like the Red Cross, like Team Rubicon and others, and bringing them together under an umbrella, like an NGO consortium that works as auxiliary to government with Public Safety Canada, we're then able to identify what capabilities certain organizations bring to the table and what their ability to respond is. So whether that's timelines, whether that's going to be mobility requirements that could then be supported through CAF strategic airlift or through rotary wing airlift that's required. Those are the kinds of things that the CAF and the role that the CAF could play to be able to enhance what volunteers already do. And if we look to the German system, they have 80,000 volunteers spread across the country in 800 different locations with a single national training center. Everybody gets coordinated, standardized training to be able to go and respond. And that is what's been done to alleviate the strain on their military. If we look at Australia, they have a similar system in place where they have different regional, so they're provincial organizations that actually do response. They're entirely volunteer-based. And they've partnered with organizations that leverage the skill sets specifically that first responders, that military veterans bring to the table, that civilians bring to the table, so that we don't have random person number 3 showing up and saying, you're now in charge of building inspections to make sure that building is viable for people to go in and it's safe.
Right. And sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I am limited on time. So I just wanted to sneak in another question on that very point in regards to, and you served as well, and we just finished a retention and recruitment study in terms of some of the testimony that came up too was that not everybody wants necessarily international deployment or a lifestyle that might challenge them with that, but could you see, or maybe you have knowledge of an option where people would like to be engaged in their country in, let's say, a disaster situation or emergency, but perhaps doesn't want the lifestyle of an Army reservist or someone that needs to deploy? Is that somehow fit into what you're thinking of as well? Is there an appetite there that you think would exist?
I believe so. I don't necessarily see that being nested within the Canadian Armed Forces. It costs a lot of money to train somebody to be a soldier or to be an officer, and it doesn't matter what the trade is. The cost associated with that initial training can be better put towards supporting NGOs that already bring those skill sets, that already have those connections, and that already understand how disaster management in the country works, rather than necessarily filling it with somebody coming in who is there to help and who will always continue to serve the country and support in any way possible, but doesn't necessarily have the right language to be able to communicate with the people that are on the ground, that are provincial organization, federal organizations, and municipal.
Well, thank you very much.
Merci à l'ensemble des témoins. Je vais poser des questions.
Thank you all to the witnesses. I'd like to ask some general questions, and And if you would like to answer, just jump right in. And later on, I'll come back to the form that some sort of parallel militia could have, because that seems to be the topic. I'll ask other questions about what form it could take in terms of the climate crises, etc. But first, I'd like to ask a question about what this militia would be used for. And should there be some sort of gradation of events that they could be called upon to intervene in? For example, filling sandbags for a flood is not the same thing as evacuating people during a major fire. The level of danger is different. The level of organization required is different. So should we first ask ourselves what the cost ratio is for certain of the operations that we're asking the military to do? Is it more relevant to ask systematically whether the civilians want to do the filling of the sandbags and saying there'll never be any members of the military doing this because it's not worth it? Is it the kind of thing we should be thinking about first? In other words, asking ourselves what this should be used for and at what point we should allow the armed forces to intervene.
I'll just say that I think one of the problems is that for a lot of other mission sets the military has, they're based on mandates. Like, we want to protect North America, we want to contribute to global security with allies. And that gets married with the generation of certain capabilities. We're going to be able to deploy 2 task groups of 4 warships simultaneously. We're going to be able to simultaneously deploy 1,500 soldiers on contingents to work with allies. There's no force generation goal that's associated with assisting domestic emergency response. And it creates a kind of a function that the military is going to find ways to support that. And so there's this kind of socialization that's been happening over time that we've talked about, where the military is increasingly doing more and more things that it's not specifically trained to do, but there's a societal and provincial expectation. One of the things before we even get into this would be, how do the requests get filtered through public safety, and how do they determine where the military can define its role better and where it can and cannot assist? Because societally, it'll be unacceptable to Canadians if there's a domestic emergency response, there's no one else there, and the military comes in if they're placed on a cap. But it's kind of getting out of this, and I think there's going to have to be a part where the military says, we're going to contribute these things to emergency response, and that frees up space and kind of almost pressure into other orders of government and other parts of the federal service to figure out how to organize those things. So it's a transition, but I think it's the way things are going is it's disincentivizing other areas and levels of the country in preparing for domestic emergency response. And that's a very hard challenge, because the military is never going to say, well, we're only going to contribute 1,000 soldiers a year, and when those are used up, we're not going to do any more emergency response. Because societally, we're just getting primed to expect that from the forces.
May I also add to that, please?
Je vous en prie.
Yes, please go ahead.
I would also just like the committee to consider a note of caution when discussing volunteers. Canada has been very, very lucky in the past several decades in our domestic response in taking things like the Manitoba flood or the ice storm or even recent flooding. COVID is probably the most lengthy and enduring crisis response that we've had to deal with in our history, when we talk about responses in terms of months rather than days or weeks. And this is where volunteers can get a little bit touchy or become a sensitive issue. We're assuming that volunteers are available for a lengthy duration of time, and we're assuming that volunteers will stay and are available. We've been very lucky in some of our major domestic crisis operations that society has been able to step up and volunteer, but we also have to consider if that will be the case in future domestic crises as well. Thank you.
Peut-être à moins qu'il y ait d'autres gens qui veulent.
Unless anybody else wants to respond, in terms of the cost-benefit ratio, I'd like to hear what you have to say, because the usefulness of a soldier in a situation where nobody else can intervene is not the same thing as a soldier doing something that civilians could be doing, but maybe it would cost, there's a big difference in what it costs. Should we be considering that in our analysis of what the military should and shouldn't be doing?
Well, Let me just start by saying, please, that I'm a firm supporter that the CAF should not be the lead element in domestic crisis response. The CAF should be there and available when called on, and it should be there to act decisively when called on. And as such, this is why I think a military response in many cases is just simply not going to go away. It's culturally accepted that by Canadians that when they call, the Canadian forces will respond to the public. But that said, this is why I'm calling on almost the institutionalization or reevaluation of the reevaluation of the terms and conditions that a reserve soldier would serve under. They're not as expensive as a professional or regular force soldier, but Canadians should be able to call on their part-time military to respond in a lengthy and decisive manner when all other means have failed. Thank you.
Ms. Normandine, colleagues, we're going to have to suspend at this point. We've got, 15 minutes before? I guess but the first question is I want to canvass the witnesses. If we came back in half an hour, would you still be available? I say 1, 2, 3.
Mr. McDonald says he has to go by 6.
And yes, well, we have this slot till basically till 6 o'clock. So if it took us half an hour to go and vote and come back and get started again, we get started shortly after 5. So it'd still give us 45, 50 minutes, but then we're not going to be able to do any committee business. And the clerk needs some directions with respect to future business. So, well, maybe that's it. Maybe the trouble is then we're running up to the budget issues. So, anyway, meeting is suspended, and we'll see you back here as soon as practicable, 10 minutes after vote is read. Thank you. Again, apologize for this starting late and being interrupted and running late, and it just is the way things are in May and June when the government in particular is trying to get its budget passed, and there's lots of interruptions between starts and finishes. So I'll leave it to the clerk to take you out and bring you back. Again, thank you for your patience.
Sir.
Colleagues, it's 5:15. We have until 6 o'clock. Our witnesses have been very gracious and have stayed around. Before I call on Ms. Matheson, what I'm proposing for this week is that the committee business be put on to next Wednesday, and hopefully we'll have some sort of consensus as to what we want to do with the various items on the committee business. And I'll just remind you that a week today, the final hour, we have the Swedish delegation coming, and hopefully we'll be able. I'm not quite sure where we are in the invitations to the embassy, but it is what it is. So with that, Ms. Matheson, catch your breath, and you have 6 minutes, please.
It's more the train of thought that I have to catch more than anything. Thank you to the witnesses. Before we had our pause, we were talking about bringing in the idea of volunteers, whether that's through NGOs, specifically named ones, how we support that, how that would work out. My concern in that conversation, of course, is that, I mean, we're dealing with very stressed situations, moments of crisis, and they can spin out of control very, very quickly. So I think that we were talking about before how we figure out that very specific strategy of who has control, who manages that, who takes over at what time, and how we sort of delve into that. One of the things that was also said was in terms of, you know, those who can fill sandbags and help in terms of flood mitigations or what have you. Maybe that is something that volunteers could do, but evacuation of a city is very different. And I would even argue that in terms of when we sent our troops into long-term care facilities, some of them did contract COVID, and we don't know the long-term impacts of that and what's required. Ideally, you know, everybody remains safe, but what would the government's role be in all of that, in terms of that management, if something should, in fact, occur? What are the backups or the procedures that need to be put into place if something like that were to move forward and something truly bad did happen, when you have volunteers who necessarily aren't fully trained like a member of the armed forces? And that's for all the witnesses. Anybody? Jump in there.
If I may, please. Thank you, ma'am. If I can just touch on Madame Normandin's question from before the break, I think it dovetails quite nicely. Having personally helped draft requests for federal assistance in 2016, we actually shifted the emphasis of those letters from requesting specific CAF assets to requesting desired effects. So Public Safety Canada has a federal capabilities list, and it's Public Safety Canada that determines which federal department or agency has the most appropriate assets for achieving whatever that desired effect is. Often that comes from the CAF, but often it isn't. And given that these desired effects vary depending on the location and the type of disaster, establishing a dedicated disaster response force within the CAF would necessarily draw on all other elements of the CAF. And therefore, we'd only be adding additional bureaucracy and overhead instead of streamlining it. So as Mr. Fejes pointed out, reservists deploy only when they volunteer to do so. And when they do put their hands up, they get paid, which registers an incremental cost to government. So I think this takes us back to the option of enabling our disaster NGO community to do what they do best, what they're purpose-built to do, and respond to disasters and support Canadians. And by establishing provisions to enable employers to grant leave for a week or two, as they do with some reserve deployments, people can then volunteer, and we can actually build a robust, resilient capability that costs orders of magnitude less than establishing new capabilities in the CAF or cannibalizing existing forces. And that actually frees up the CAF to fill their role as the force of last resort. So to the question of who's in charge, it's always the local authority that's in charge. And so once a local authority, the municipality, the county, whatever it happens to be, declares that state of emergency, they can then request provincial support. And the province, if the province declares either a localized or a provincial state of emergency, they're the organization that would then request federal assistance, whether that's CAF or not. And so a lot of the provisions that are put in place to support volunteers and to enable volunteers that go to support a disaster response, the mechanisms are already there. And so just ensuring that as we build out legislation and a framework to enable employers to let their people go and volunteer for a week, we need to extend occupational health and safety legislation so that we can protect the people who are volunteering.
The only thing I would say too is, I mean, these are always provincial requests, right? So they are responsible. So the provinces have a big role in this. And I think that a lot of what they focus on now is management, which is about coordination of existing resources and not so much about developing and building services themselves. And I think that that's where we're getting this kind of this skip where we're at the local and then we have the federal and the provincial. It depends on different provinces, but there is a bit of a gap there. And I think that some of it has been a function of the increasing reliance of being able to draw on the CAF and other federal resources. Sometimes the provinces pay those back, but again, sometimes they won't have to. The CAF isn't going to be going around asking for money from provinces. So I think that's a big problem. And I would just say that there's two things. There's one about, do we just need better coordination of mechanisms? Like we ought to find the capabilities and we bring them together, or do we have to actually build capability at all levels and a bit more of kind of a specialization? And I think that that's where we're really needed. And I think that the coordination piece is super important, but when you get something like the pandemic on top of regularized natural disasters, then there's this stress function that happens where everyone's asking for help and support. And I think that the trajectory of climate change is that places where we didn't think were going to be climate change issues are becoming climate change issues, communities and things. And I think BC completely took the government, the provincial government, the floods there completely by surprise. They couldn't believe it. They were basically saying these were kind of municipal level issues and they should coordinate. And it was clear after 1 or 2 days that this was a regional disaster and it needed major capabilities at all levels and coordination. So it's not just about the coordination piece, it's about building up and specialization. And I think, unfortunately, the CAF is being asked to do a lot of the just giving the capability part and kind of relieving some provincial responsibilities.
Okay, we're going to have to leave that answer there. Ms. Madison, Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes. I'm going to try and get a full second round in, and we might have a minute or two left over, but we'll start off with Ms. Gallant. 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, the foremost capability the CAF has relied upon in disasters is its command and control system. Before the National Emergency Preparedness College was deemed unnecessary, it trained leadership at the municipal level to be for a state of readiness and to marshal response locally before calling on our National Defense Force. So there were exercises at the local level, graduating to more widespread scenarios, so that everybody knew how to work together in a state of emergency. Do you think it would be a more effective use of our resources to reestablish an emergency preparedness college rather than calling in the military whenever it's a major weather event? And that's to all of them, all the witnesses.
I'm happy to jump on that one first. One of the things that's been done around the country and in multiple different post-secondaries is actually establish emergency management training. So we have diplomas, degrees, and graduate level programs that exist. We also have professional development training centers. And whether that is at Algonquin College in Ottawa or the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology here in Edmonton or the Justice Institute of BC in the Vancouver area, we do have places where people come to train and where people actually come and learn from each other. I know that we host an annual event where we bring 400 people from across the country together to be able to train and to share experiences and to share learning. So providing funding to the post-secondaries that are already doing this would be hugely helpful. And then in terms of reestablishing that National Emergency Preparedness College, establishing standardized core capabilities and core competencies at the national level for emergency management would greatly help standardize curriculum and training across the country. And so I think that's the focus, rather than building a brand new bricks and mortar facility. Leverage the capabilities that are already there in the post-secondaries and the training institutions. And it's far more cost effective.
And from the private sector, they can tailor make a plan for a community. Now, the carbon tax was initially marketed to the Canadian public on the notion that the revenues would be directed to adaptation and mitigation. Now, in your experience, have the carbon taxes been directed to adaptation and mitigation, or simply to emergency response, if any goes to emergency response?
I know myself, I don't know the answer to that question at all, no, sorry.
So,
Sorry, myself as well. I am not prepared to comment on that. That's outside the realm of my research and expertise. Sorry.
So to what extent do you think that the infrastructure mitigation measures and adaptation measures would help prevent some of these catastrophic events that we're seeing in terms of high water, for example?
While I can't speak directly to any budgetary allocations, what we do know from multiple studies is that for every dollar invested in mitigation and preparedness activities, we save 6 to 8 on response and an additional 12 on recovery after a disaster. So if we're looking at a 20 to 1 return on investment, then focusing on mitigation measures is absolutely essential. And focusing on the preparedness side, which is training, building plans, coordination, and building out those mechanisms, that's also going to be the most cost-effective use of our resources.
How to describe the harms done to the militia during the hooks and ladder days of civil defense during the Cold War?
If you are, that'll be quite interesting. Does anybody want to take that question, or does it feel that they have any capability of taking that question?
Okay. All right, let's go to another one.
Oh,
we can come back to that.
You're down to 5 seconds.
How do you view the use of the troops in strikes, the FLQ, the Oka crisis?
That's an interesting question, but it's not going to get answered. Mr. Spengelman.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all three of our witnesses for being with us and for their service in uniform and out of uniform. Thank you for your expertise. The debate nationally and internationally can be grouped into the cluster of the 3 Cs: climate, COVID, and conflict, really sort of cross-fertilizing each other into crises that we have not anticipated and that we need to respond to. For us, as parliamentarians, it's a question of making sure that the investments are being made into addressing them. Would you say, is it fair to say that in Canada at the moment we have the expertise on DRR, on emergency preparedness and response, and it's just a question of restructuring that expertise into a more effective organization? Or are there still significant gaps in expertise that we need to address through recruitment, either on the civilian or the military side? Whoever would like to take that, I'll take all three of you if you have views on it, or just one of you.
Outbreak of Canadian politeness.
Jump in.
Please,
Sorry,
go ahead.
I'll jump in first. Okay, thank you very much. I think that's almost a double-headed question, if I may, Mr. Chair. First and foremost, the expertise for crisis management response will reside within the government, federal, provincial, and municipal. There's varying amounts of expertise that reside within the Canadian Forces. It's the Canadian Forces, however, who remains responsive to government direction. And the Canadian Forces is prepared to respond to crisis management in any way that the government directs. So asking for the Canadian Forces to hold specific expertise is not necessarily the question. You would almost have to defer that to federal and municipal agencies before that can be responded accurately. Thank you.
That's a fair comment, and thank you for that. I'm interested in Mr. Bowen's mention of the German model, of which there are some champions here on Parliament Hill, the Civil Defense Volunteer Force. This is a process and a structure that really took decades to build. If Canada were to go down that road, Professor Bowen, what would be sort of the three priorities that we really need to be seized with to make sure that happens? And then maybe grafted onto that question, how much need would there be for civil-military coordination and cooperation if and when such a structure is built?
That's a great question, and definitely one that there are other people who are far more knowledgeable about in terms of exactly building that structure. What I will say, though, is that we need to identify the core capabilities that we require. We need to identify who has them already so that we're not duplicating effort. The last thing that we want is everybody to show up to a disaster with a left-handed screwdriver when what we really need is a hammer. So we need to be able to identify what those core capabilities are and then leverage the skill sets that people already have, that already exist, and coordinate that. So identifying the capabilities, identifying a coordination mechanism, and that will necessarily involve the government, it will involve civil society, and it will involve the military at some point. And then determining how we most cost effectively fund that model. The other piece that it will require is bringing in post-secondaries to be able to actually support the training and the ongoing professionalization of the field. And that's really where I would start.
Thank you very much for that. The area of civil-military coordination is interesting because we will need it here at home unless we seize either the private sector fully or the civilian sector fully or the military fully with the question of disaster response and mitigation. Is there a synergy between civ-mil coordination expertise gained here at home and later deployment of the same members of the Canadian Forces elsewhere in the world where civ-mil coordination is critical to doing peacekeeping, reconstruction, humanitarian protection work? Is there actually something synergetic that we could develop and tap into?
Well, I think, as you know from your work in Iraq, coordinating civil-military response is absolutely essential, and it doesn't matter whether it's conflict or it's a disaster response. Being able to build mechanisms where people can share ideas, share information, and then appropriately allocate that information and those resources to be able to respond to whatever the crisis of the day is absolutely essential. So yes, there are multilateral and multi-agency coordination mechanisms that we could leverage. There are also coordination mechanisms here at home and in our closest allies that we could look to leverage.
Mr. Chair, I have 5 seconds left. Could you send us what you have on Australia? It's not a case we've looked at as a committee yet, but I think we'd be grateful if you had any material there.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Penguin. Madame Normandy, 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. All the witnesses talked about the role of reservists, but we know that they're relatively underutilized. Perhaps this has an impact on the capacity for retention. We've just completed a study. When there's an underuse, people tend to be unmotivated to remain. But when we think about certain kinds of reservists, such as the Rangers, who have a very specific function, and they know that there will be work for them, is that something that could be envisaged? In other words, some sort of special unit for reservists for specific response in terms of national crises. Could that be a kind of win-win hybrid solution, and which would be useful also for recruitment?
I'll try and jump in there first, please. When it comes to actually trying to develop niche capabilities in the reserve force, various historical studies have found varying rates of success. Initially, reserve units have been tasked with things like laundry and bath units in support of the regular force. and found atrocious retention rates, whereas conventional infantry units continue to attract and retain reserve recruits. So you have to tread very carefully with the idea of creating specialty niche units within the reserves, where again, participation is voluntary, or at least currently voluntary. The idea now, because the demands that are placed on primary reserve members are so wide and vary so greatly, is instead of actually trying to develop niche capabilities, which rely again on volunteers who may or may not determine they're going to provide their service or not, my recommendation is that we actually look at broadening the terms of service for the reserves so that they can be called upon when needed, but that they come with a wide and broad variety of skills. Additionally, creating domestic response reserve units would mean that they have specialized skills and trainings, and they would not be able to deploy internationally when called upon as well. So you want to maintain as broad a pool of reservists, and you want to be able to call on those broad pools of reservists decisively when crisis happens. Thank you.
Can I just
Madam
say
Normandin?
something quickly too? Oh, sorry.
Can you work it in with Ms. Matheson's question? Because Ms. Matheson always follows Ms. Normandin, and so 2.5 minutes.
Because we have such good questions. One of the issues that was mentioned in terms of drawing on the reservists, I believe, was duration of time. Can you provide the other problems that we would have to look at in order to, I guess, proactively assess what would be required? So, I mean, I would think about time from family, a lot what Canadian Armed Forces already have to deal with, but, you know, housing, all of those things. Can you try and give us a quick list, or? And then, yes, certainly I will give my time to Mr. McDonald as well.
I just want to say quickly that I think when we think about reservists, we can think of two broad models. We can think of a strategic reserve. They do the same thing as a regular force, but we just augment them either in time of war or we need it. When we were in Afghanistan in the mid-2000s, 30% of the combat battalion there was reservists. It was vital. Or you can have functional reservists, that they do different things from the regular force. We saw this in the Navy. The reservists in the Navy had their own ships, the maritime coastal defense vessels, and other types of tasks and duties. But now we're seeing this movement kind of back towards more strategic reserves. We have a one Navy concept, to use a Navy example, but we still see this idea of trying to do a bit of a dance to try to do both. And I think that that is kind of strategically misguided, and there needs to be a far more reconceptualization of the purpose of the reserves within the military and within communities. I think reservists are a great way to broaden the appeal of the military. They're usually some of the most diverse. They're usually in urban centers. A lot of major military bases aren't in urban centers anymore. The regular force is kind of a bit distant from Canadians, whereas reservists have a bit more of a direct connection there. I think there's no more full-time reservists. The reservists are supposed to be part-time, and that gets to the problem that we need legislative pay for quick call-ups. Not things like in 3 months we're going to deploy you for 2 months. It's going to be like, hey, in a week we need you for 6 months. How do we action that with major industry and other businesses? I think another thing is reservists deserve credit. They need medals and recognition for service. The military has an expeditionary-oriented view that service and value is largely based on international deployments. I can tell you, it's way harder to go to the Canadian Arctic than it is to go to Afghanistan. And I think that recognition of that. And the third thing I'll say is the reservists have brought in interesting recruiting mechanisms to try to bring in more people quickly. But what's happened is the retention at mid-level reservists has dramatically decreased. And so there's a huge issue about how to train and retain these people because they can't get their training done because we just don't have mid-level reservists to do that. It's a huge challenge in the reserves. It probably needs a complete full rethink, in my opinion.
Ms. Matheson, Mr. Motts, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I just wanted to bring, I guess, this full circle back to why we exist as a committee, and it's about national defense. And I want to quote a couple of quotes here from, Lieutenant General Eyre. He was the Canadian Army commander at the time, and now he's CDS. And I want to quote 2 times. So in 2020, Mr. Ayres said, if we became focused solely on humanitarian assistance and disaster response when the country really needs us, when the stakes are very high and we have to fight and we're not ready, this is going to cause casualties and it's going to cost loss of national interest. He went on in October of 2021 where he said that involvement in domestic operations reduced resources available to confront challenges and threats to world security, which continue to increase. So, Mr. Bowen, I have some questions directed to you. You have mentioned, and I would agree with you, that we need to re-examine how we deploy and how we deal with natural disaster-related events in our country. And so, if that's the case, and you prefer from your testimony to more of a reserve force or something along those lines, what composition of regular force and reserve force personnel is needed to ensure effective response to what the defense should be doing, national defense, CAF, and what our reserve force could be doing with regards to natural disasters?
Thank you, sir. And, I had the distinct honor of serving under General Air in Western Canada and during the Fort McMurray wildfire event. I actually would not advocate for establishing a reserve force specifically to deal with disasters. If we do that, we are cannibalizing from existing forces and existing capabilities because we will necessarily need to draw on the regular force Air Force, the regular force Army, Navy to be able to respond and to be able to support the mobility, the logistical sustainment, the transportation, the communication, all of those other assets and capabilities that so many NGOs actually bring to the table.
Right,
so
and
I do think.
Sorry for interrupting. And I misquoted what you said. I said reservists. What I'm thinking about, as you started speaking again, sir, I apologize. You're more talking about a civilian corps, like you mentioned, Red Cross, Samaritan's Purse, and others like those NGOs who do such great work. So, can you reinforce to us what advantages that would be from a cost perspective, from a training perspective, to the Canadian taxpayer, and to a response theater, like their capabilities as opposed to how we're doing things now?
First and foremost, I would say that building hyper-localized, trained and equipped volunteer teams across the country is going to drastically reduce the time and cost that it takes to mobilize during a disaster. If we look to my earlier comments about the typical daily incremental cost for a CAF deployment is about $80,000. NGOs can respond for less than $5,000, $3,000 a day to do similar tasks. So leveraging those organizations that rely on volunteers that are unpaid, that are there to be able to support their fellow Canadian is something that we should be looking to do. More importantly, they already have mechanisms in place for coordinating the deployment and the employment of those volunteers. So rather than just having a federal agency or a provincial organization respond and then have to deal with an influx of volunteers that continue to show up and donations and all of those kinds of things, having an overarching federal coordination mechanism where we're able to say, Samaritan's Purse, you have these skill sets. Red Cross, you have these skill sets. Team Rubicon Canada, you have these skill sets. These are what we need. These are the effects we need to achieve. Can you support? And then they say yes with localized response capabilities, drastically reduces the cost and the time required to mobilize.
But the clock doesn't lie. 6 seconds. Thank you. Mr. May, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, thank you all for your patience today and for your expertise. This has been fascinating, and I have to admit I've sort of lost track a little bit in terms of who supports more of a civilian led force versus a maybe something within the CAF is, or are you all sort of on the same page there? Maybe we can go through. I know, Mr. Bowen, you had suggested more of a civilian led. Do the three of you concur, or the two of you concur with Mr. Bowen?
If I may jump in first, please. Obviously, I want to say that I concur with Mr. Bowen. A civilian-led agency is by far superior to anything that the CAF would be able to produce, because the CAF has conflicting priorities and obligations at most given times. In addition, I also just want to highlight something he said, where the more prepared municipalities and provinces are to actually assist with domestic crisis response, the better the Canadian Forces will actually be able to come in and assist as well. So this is really a win-win situation for everyone involved to see preparedness across the board. Where I think I differ from my esteemed colleague is the idea of unpaid volunteers taking the lead, because I would want to actually do some research into how long that model would be sustainable before the Canadian Forces came in to actually provide additional support. Thank you.
I see Mr. Bowen was sort of shaking his head there a little bit. Do you want to respond to that, or with regard, maybe there's a misrepresentation there?
Thank you, sir. If I may, I agree that the Canadian Forces needs to come in as an augmentation force, and that we should have a civilian, largely volunteer-based organization leading. Whenever there is a disaster response, the local authority always has jurisdiction. So it would never be volunteers acting alone independently of that local authority, providing the jurisdiction, providing the legal framework for the volunteers to be able to respond. And then having an organization function that says, you're going to fulfill this role, you're going to fulfill this role, you're going to fulfill that role, and then allowing the volunteer organizations, the NGOs, to be able to fill those roles. I think that's where we need to get to.
And Mr. McDonald?
My big thing that comes from this is that it's the Canadian government and the Canadian people that decide what their military is for. And I think that that members in uniform and generals and stuff can talk about competing priorities. And I think that they're doing is they're bringing up an issue with saying, we're having issues doing all of this. We think that it's going to be increasingly difficult. And they want a political solution, I think, honestly. I think there'll be some that say the military is about combat, it's about deploying overseas, it's about warfare. I think a military is whatever a government wants it to be and what the public wants it to be. And I think that we need to start thinking about it as political direction rather than kind of letting, as again, this mission creep. My own feeling is that, as I said, there's lots of expertise out there that my colleagues have talked about. I think the CAF has a really big role to play. And I think that there's a way that we can carve it down into something that's more feasible and doable in a better intricate web of organizations. Because I worry about this idea of super CAF, the Swiss Army knife of CAF that can be deployed in everything and anything. I think that has huge problems for members' retention, to be quite honest, for training, for misallocation of resources. But again, I think we need to talk about this politically and not so much about this is a technical solution, how do we build out this thing or that thing. I think we need a bit more of a political conversation about what we want the military to do and what it's for.
Now, we've talked a little bit about the Australian model, the German model, the U.S. With their the engineering core they have there. The German model, I don't know enough about it to make this suggestion, but I'm wondering, they have a mandatory service model once you graduate high school and into the military, but they also have, if you're a pacifist, you can go into an NGO and support that way. Is this an extension of that, or sort of a spin-off of that, or does it have anything to do with their mandatory service after high school?
My understanding, as limited as it is that the German model requires mandatory national service, and that doesn't necessarily mean the military. It could be working in a senior's residence. It could be driving an ambulance to free up a paramedic to actually work on the patient, those kinds of things. So yes, there are definitely people who volunteer for the Technische Hilfswerks, the THW, which is the model that we're discussing. And those people then continue to volunteer for many of them for the rest of their lives, doing different sorts of disaster response.
Thank you, Mr. May. Colleagues, we've got a little over 10 minutes left, and if I do a 2-minute round, we can get another round of questions in. So we'll start with the Conservatives and Mr. Allison, 2 minutes. Welcome to the committee. You're a very pleasant addition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's great work with you again as well. And once again, to our witnesses today, thank you once again for what you do and your service to this country. Since I only have 2 minutes, I guess my question would be to you, Adam. You mentioned about, and you've talked about a few times about political issue, political will. So I guess my question is, what do you mean by that? Is it really more political direction? I thought you made a great point. I mean, the Army belongs to the Canadian people. And so what you are saying then that, regardless of what it is, it's got to be directed in terms of leadership. In other words, if the government says we should do A, B, or C, that would be sort of the political will to have it happen.
My big thing, I think, is that when you look at the mandates of the CAF, there's about 8 of them, and a lot of them are domestic, like search and rescue, guarding coastlines, NORAD, and then domestic emergency response is a very specific one. But there's no parallel about, okay, this is the mission that's achieved, or the mandate, and we're going to generate these forces. We need to have this many Navy ships, this many soldiers, and it leads to this vagueness about that there's no corollary about what does the military have to build in terms of force generate to do domestic emergency response. And I think there, combined with this societal growing expectation that the military is going to be called in every time there's a domestic emergency response, I think it's really draining the organization a little bit. And I think that it's kind of creating confusion. And the only thing I would say is that there's big debates about what a military is and isn't. And I think that I think generals and others are talking about the need to have this political decision, and I think that it does start from really the top. We have to really more clearly define what we want our military to do, what we want to focus on, what we want to build. Do we have healthcare capacity just to service the military, or do we decide, you know what, we're actually going to build out the healthcare capacity of the military to service domestic emergency response? We have an example of the DART team, the Disaster Assistance Response Team, which is an expeditionary overseas capability. Do we want to build a domestic DART or something in the military? I just think that this has got to get beyond the confines of D&D and become more political and public as we enter the engagements about the defense review.
Thank you.
Mr. Fisher, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. If I'm talking really, really quickly, it's because I only have 2 minutes. Mr. McDonald, you spoke to this, so I'll go with you first, but I really wish I had the time to have all comments. But are any provinces building or preparing for emergency management or disaster response other than the obvious roadblocks like budget and people? What stands in their way? Who has a better chance of building a volunteer group, a provincial entity or a federal entity? And will a province even consider doing that if they can already request help from the CAF? And I know I gave you an awful lot to think about there, but you've got like a minute left. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'll first off by saying that the provinces are very different. They all have different challenges that they face, and some have dealt with it very differently. Newfoundland got rid of its emergency management organization. They don't have anything. And then you have BC. And BC is a very interesting case where for a long time they've been worried about earthquake, and they've been building up earthquake management. And then all of a sudden you had the floods and the fires of last year, which really kind of came as a shock. I think going off of my other colleagues' points is, I think the local is the best way of doing it. I think that we're missing that middle piece, which is the provinces. And I think that the provinces can do more in terms of coordination and funding and kind of guiding that kind of pooling of resources. My sense is that the difficulty that the CAF faces, one is like it usually goes to the CAF when it gets to the federal level, but those requests are based on the ground. And we've already seen during COVID some requests that seem very pitiful when they got answered. We only sent a couple of rangers, for example, to an Indigenous community that was entirely under lockdown because of COVID. And there was some blowback, but then it was like, well, what is the information that we're based upon? It's based upon the local and the provincial request, because that's the way this works. It always goes to the provinces and out. So I think the province is the level. I think we got to figure out ways that federal government can help support funding and training at the provincial level to further kind of enable those municipal ones. Because my sense is that, again, the reliance on the CAF is taking away from that.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. 2 minutes, 0.29 seconds, right on. Yeah. Madame Normandine, 1 minute, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. In another panel, a witness mentioned the idea of creating a reserve that would be used during regular times to improve the infrastructure of First Nations and remote communities, but could easily be called upon to respond if there were to be a crisis. Is that an idea worth exploring?
If I may, please. The Canadian Forces has an overriding policy of not competing with domestic business and not competing with domestic economies. So calling in the military to actually conduct routine, I would guess I would call it economic development, for lack of a better term, would probably not be well received domestically, as well as, once again, you're taking resources away from the Canadian Forces, who ideally would be either training, deploying, responding, or doing something else. And again, I've voiced my opinion on creating specific units of reserves to complete specific tasks, in which case they're not available or not trained to complete other tasks. The idea, and I just want to come around to what I've been advocating for this entire session, is that we want to figure out how to get the largest pool of military assistance to the greatest number of Canadians for decisive and enduring effects, right? And to me, that's the question that we actually have to be dealing with here.
And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I apologize.
Of course.
Madame Masson, 1 minute, please.
Well, I think my question sort of stems from, again, that overall conversation. I mean, I know that Peguis First Nation up in northern Manitoba, they are dealing with flooding year after year after year. So if we're going along the lines of shifting towards more of that provincial jurisdiction or provincial answering of the call, for our First Nation, I mean, that's not their primary communicator, right? They go to the federal government. So can you just expand on how a nation like Peguis would deal with this flooding year after year in this model that was suggested with the previous, I think, Mr. Fisher's questioning?
If I may jump in, and I apologize, my camera stopped working. This is why we need to have a federal coordination of both NGOs and federal provincial response capabilities. The nation-to-nation relationship has to be protected and is so critical. So having the ability for First Nations to then reach directly out to the federal government and say, we require assistance, these are the things we require. Then Public Safety Canada has the ability to say, these are the federal assets that we have that can support and respond. And also, here's the NGO capabilities that can support and respond. And if we were to go one step further, actually do what the Americans do and have a national business emergency operation center where they leverage the capabilities of private enterprise to be able to respond and support. So bringing that whole of society together at the federal level is actually going to enable us to be able to respond more quickly and more locally than devolving it to the provinces.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Mr. Motts, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again. You know, Mr. I'm going to not say your name right again, Mr. Ferez or Fayash. There we go. You had made a comment earlier in response to a question that was asked. I don't remember who asked it, or my colleagues, was whether civilians can actually, volunteers can actually do the job expected sometimes of emergency management people. And I can tell you from experience, I'm a duty director graduate from the Emergency Preparedness College here in Ottawa. I've been on a number of disasters in our community, and I can tell you that some of our best people were volunteering for those positions and did an admirable job. And so I would agree with Mr. I think all of you, to some degree, certainly agree that having a civilian response, municipal level, then province, supported by the feds as far as funding and training, might be the model that we need to go to moving forward. And I guess so. I'm going to go back to Mr. Bowen again because he's closest to home for me. And I would ask, in an ideal world with 1 minute left, again, I'm asking my ideal world question. So if we're going to No, I got a minute.
Spit it out.
I've been timing. We have, you want to make this happen. Your plan, you have a plan you articulated today. What's the first 2 or 3 things we have to do to make that happen from the federal level to push it back to provinces and municipalities?
That's a very big question for 1 minute. Thank you for that, sir. I think in that ideal world, the first thing we need to do is reach out to the provinces and to the NGO community and say, what are the capabilities that you have? Then look at the long history of disasters that we've had and said, what are the capabilities that are needed? Once we can identify those 2 gaps, we can fund appropriately and we can allocate funding towards the NGO community to be able to support and respond and develop those capabilities where they have best expertise. And also to the post-secondary community where they're able to build those training centers and build that curriculum so that we can actually have people employed to the same standard and trained to the same standard.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Madame Lambropoulos, final 2 minutes.
So thank you. I have 2 minutes. Mr. Bowen, if you wanted to finish your answer to that previous question, because I thought it was a good one. If not, I can go on.
Thank you. Actually, I was done.
Okay. So my major question, and I apologize if it's already been answered because it's late in the game at this point and we've been cut off a couple of times. But would it, in your view specifically, Mr. Bowen, because you've been a member of the armed forces and because you've gone on some missions within Canada to help in disaster situations, do you not think that the CAF could have a second stream of people that it recruits that are specifically there not to fight? And I know that there's the universality of service rule that applies, but would it not be beneficial to move away from that and to have a sector within the CAF that deals specifically with emergency situations that are within the country and that are related to climate?
Thank you. I think that's actually a really important question to sum up on. When I was in the CAF, I was never trained how to respond to a flood. I was never trained how to respond to a wildfire. I did both. And that was because it was residual capacity from warfighting training. And it's the organizational structure and the logistical structure that the CAF brings that enables it to be able to respond. If we want to be able to respond to disasters in a way that is the most effective, we need to rely on the civilian capacity that already exists so that we're not duplicating effort. And that when things do exceed that civilian capacity, we're then able to bring in that force of last resort being the CAF and saying, here's some organized labor that is deployable and self-sustainable that we can then throw at the problem when we've exhausted all other options.
Unfortunately, that'll have to bring it to an end.
Thank you.
I want to, on behalf of the committee, thank all 3 of you for your thoughtfulness. You certainly have launched our study in the right direction. And I also want to thank you for your patience. I apologize for the interruptions, but this is the way things operate around here, and we all get used to it. So with that, colleagues, we will adjourn this meeting and meet again next Wednesday, the Lord and the votes willing. Next Wednesday. Well, next Wednesday is 2 days. Yeah. Okay. This Wednesday. Oh, okay. Thanks again.
Thank you.